So this is lesson 11. In this lesson, we'll be talking about how we can scaffold interpersonal communication, or in other words, helping our learners to talk to other people in the target language. For this lesson, we're going to touch briefly on the different levels of proficiency, and the performance characteristics that are typical of each of those levels of proficiency. We'll talk about how we might support the cognitive processes required for learners to interpret and exchange information as they're participating in sustained inquiry, and we'll help learners to exchange information, ideas, and opinions in the interpersonal mode. So what do we mean by proficiency? A lot of people think of proficiency as just having the learner use the target language. But there are some specific things that we need to focus on that are characteristics of proficiency. The first is the idea that it is language use that occurs in real-world situations. The second is that that language use occurs spontaneously in interactions, in a non-rehearsed context, and in a way that is acceptable and appropriate for native speakers of the language. We're going to focus on 4 levels of proficiency today, and I just want to quickly highlight the key characteristics. And the reason for this is if we don't understand levels of proficiency, it's easy for us to get caught up in all the language that our students don't know within a given task or text that we might be trying to scaffold. When we understand proficiency, we understand that what's important is for us to scaffold or provide support for the things that they maybe can't quite do successfully yet between one level and the next. So the idea is when I'm trying to scaffold language, I'm trying to scaffold my novice language learners in such a way that they can move to the intermediate level of proficiency or begin to make progress toward that level or complete tasks that maybe fall within that level that they couldn't complete on their own. And in order to do that, I have to understand what distinguishes a novice language speaker from an intermediate language speaker. So at the novice level, you can think of novice speakers like parrots. They tend to be able to only use language that they have heard, and most of the time they are repeating what they have memorized or practiced about topics that are familiar. So even though they might be able to ask and answer questions, those questions are going to generally be memorized, and they have memorized the response to it. So, hola, ¿cómo estás? And their response is, muy bien, gracias, ¿y tú? You know, hi, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? But if I deviate from that planned set of questions and responses, then communication breaks down. At the intermediate level, you can think of intermediate learners as tourists. They are able to kind of get basic needs met using sentences and strings of sentences, whereas at the novice level, we're mostly functioning in words and phrases. The intermediate learner can talk about familiar topics, they can pay for things, they can ask for directions, they can kind of get basic functions accomplished. But they are not necessarily using well-organized, well-structured, super accurate discourse. At the advanced level, we are looking at students who kind of fall into the category of being storytellers. They are now able to narrate a sequence of events, things that have happened to them. They can describe their surroundings or objects or situations. And they can do those tasks in the past, the present, and the future. They can use different time frames. Generally, these speakers speak with more ease and confidence, and they can handle unexpected complications. So maybe they're trying to accomplish a task, and the person says, I'm sorry, we're out of that, or we don't have any more, or we can't do that. They can circumlocute around words that they don't know, and they can deal with things that are unexpected. By contrast, when we think of a superior level speaker, we can think of them in terms of somebody who's more like a diplomat, who can discuss social and political issues. They can talk about things that are of interest to them, their own hobbies, and they can do that in both formal and informal settings. They can talk about complex matters in detail. They can provide structured arguments and hypotheses, and they can participate effectively in the conversation, autonomously. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me, as I have spent a lot of time thinking about proficiency, is I think that we unrealistically, especially in high school and university level courses, expect our students to be able to suddenly be at these levels when they arrive at a particular course level. So, I'm not going to worry about these kinds of communicative functions until my students get to Spanish 4 or Spanish 5, or until my students get to French 400, instead of realizing that if we want students to be able to do these things successfully by the time they reach those levels, we need to start working on these kinds of tasks in the beginning levels, but with more simple language. So if we were to look at how we want to sort of move through proficiency, this is kind of an overwhelming graphic, but the idea here is that we want to progressively move from immediate personal needs, things that are familiar, simple, concrete, and formulaic, to more global issues, informal contexts, using complex, abstract kinds of topics and language, and in more sophisticated communicative functions. So if we're going to do that, what do we actually have to scaffold? So the idea here is that once students have read or listened to or viewed something, we want them to have opportunities to talk to each other about that content in ways that increase their comprehension of both the content and the culture. And that means we're going to have to do several things. Number one, we're going to have to encourage them and model for them how we can communicate complex concepts in simple language. This is particularly important for university students because most of them are adults who are accustomed to being able to express themselves in more sophisticated ways. And so getting them to think about, how would you say this if you were trying to explain it to a 3-year-old? Not because your thinking is that of a 3-year-old, but because the language that you may possess at this particular point in your education is more simplistic. We want to invite them to analyze, evaluate, synthesize, and ask questions about the content, because that's how learners actually encode that content into long-term memory. And we want to help them connect the content that they're reading or listening or viewing to other texts and personal experiences. So we can do that by using very consistent routines and procedures. A lot of teachers assume it's all about the language, but a lot of scaffolding interpersonal communication has to do with, do we have clear processes in place for things like forming groups, distributing materials, holding class discussions? Those clear routines and procedures can reduce the cognitive load in ways that free up learners' resources to spend all their time focusing on processing the language and producing the language instead of trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? We want to make sure that there are good norms in place so that learners understand not only what they have to do, but so that there is an environment created where they feel safe in taking the risks required to express themselves in the target language. And the link at the bottom of this slide will take you to some examples of that. We want to make sure that our instructions are clear. Teachers tend to be very, very wordy when we ask students to do things. And so, as we have talked about in previous sessions, if you will ask students or provide the instructions for students by putting each step on a separate line, numbering the lines with no more than 5 lines, and asking learners to digest no more than 7 to 10 words per step. That can be abundantly helpful to them because it limits the amount of language they're having to process in order to figure out what to do. And those limits tend to fall within what we know about the amount of information that the short-term memory can handle. So this might be an example of what that would look like. Form a group of 4. Select a topic from the list. Find information about your topic in Arabic or whatever your language is. Include 3 different sources of information. Use the information to complete the group worksheet. Now you'll notice what's missing here are transitions, a lot of the things that make language more sophisticated. And that is purposeful because I'm trying to make sure that the instructions are comprehensible. I can add all of those additional things as my learners progress in their language abilities. We want to provide models and examples whenever possible. So not just giving the instructions, but then showing learners what it's going to look like to accomplish that task. And then we need to think about scaffolding language for lots of different pieces. We tend to think of it only in terms of the language they need for the task, but we actually have to scaffold all of these pieces. So we need to think about what kind of language do they need to discuss the disciplinary content or career pathway that we've chosen or that they've chosen. What kind of language might they need in order to be able to interpret texts? And that's particularly important when we think about academic language that they might encounter. So the idea here is that we are not trying to make sure that they understand every word. That is not the point of scaffolding. The point of scaffolding is to help draw their attention to keywords or phrases and help them to comprehend the keywords and phrases that are going to transfer across communicative activities and contexts. We want to think about what kind of language they're going to need for the task, meaning the processes. So turn to your partner. You have 5 minutes to accomplish the task. Get a sheet of paper out. All of the kinds of instructional types of language that we typically use, we have to scaffold. We need to think about what kind of language they're going to need to talk to each other. How are they going to add ideas into a class discussion? How are they going to ask for clarification? Do they know how to interrupt somebody who's speaking in a culturally appropriate way? And then what kind of language are they going to need to respond to the things that are being said in the class discussion? Are we teaching them rejoinders or all of those words and phrases that people in natural adult conversation use in order to show that they're listening and paying attention? And then have we thought about how we're going to scaffold instructions or scaffold technology use, the language that's required for them to do those things? So this is another document that will be in the modules that is designed to help you think about these different types of language use that you might need to scaffold. So you'll see that at the top there's a place for you to write down what texts are you going to have learners using. And you'll notice I've given you space for at least 2, because when we use more than one text, we tend to ask learners to do functions that are more pedagogically sound. More specifically, we're usually having them synthesize or talk across the texts instead of just minute monkey see, monkey do comprehension questions. And then you'll notice that I've asked you to think about what kinds of tasks you're going to have them do and what kinds of talking you're going to have them do. And then we have the 3 phases of the lesson or the project, the pre-reading, the during reading, and the post-reading. And then you're going to think about, okay, what kind of language do they need for the disciplinary content? What kind of academic language do I want to focus on? What kind of language do they need for the task? And what kind of language might they need to participate socially? So for those of you who would prefer to have kind of a list of principles for doing this, this would be my list. The ABCDEs of scaffolding interpersonal communication are that the first decision I have to make as a teacher is what is the topic that we're going to be talking about. And once I know that, the communicative function that is going to be required there. So are students going to be debating? Are they going to be discussing? What are they going to be doing with their language? Then the first decision I have to make is, how am I going to structure that activity? Am I going to use inside-outside circles? Am I going to have students each take a turn? What kinds of cooperative learning structures am I going to use? And there is a list of those for you in the modules. The second thing I have to figure out is, how am I going to break what I'm asking them to do into smaller chunks? What are the key chunks they need to think about? The third thing I need to think about is, how am I going to scaffold their engagement with the content? So what am I going to do to activate their prior knowledge, to build their background knowledge? How am I going to get them thinking about or working with what they are exploring in the text? And that might mean things like, maybe I'm taking paragraphs out of the text that they are working with and asking them to categorize. So maybe let's say they've read a newspaper article that is advocating for or against something, or discussing an issue that's controversial. Maybe I'm going to give them a T-chart, and on one half of the chart it says pros, and on the other half it says cons. And then I'm going to give them paragraphs out of the text, and I'm going to ask them to sort those paragraphs with a partner. Read the paragraph and decide, is it a pro? Is it an argument in favor of this issue? Or is it a con, an argument against this issue? So what are the things that I can have learners do physically in manipulating the text that will help them to think through or notice what I want them to notice about the content in preparation for the communication that they're going to have to do? The fourth piece is thinking about decisions. So what kinds of decisions are learners going to have to make in order to produce the language I want them to produce? And I'll show you some examples of that in just a second. And then the last piece is expression. What kinds of language pieces are they going to need in order to produce the communication? So this would be an example of inside-outside circles. So you can see that students line up in circles and they each have a partner across from them. And then they're going to have some kind of a card. So this is my activity structure. And what am I going to ask them to do? Well, in the case of this workshop, maybe I'm asking you to brainstorm ways to read a text with students. And then you'll notice below the line, I've given some hints for the person who's listening. So the top half is the question that the inside circle would ask to their partner, and the bottom half is sort of a cheat sheet or a list of answers that they might provide to their partner. This would be an example of how I might help learners make decisions. So maybe we're talking about something as simple as talking about where we're going in a city. And so I've given students copies of realia, different pieces of realia like money or metro tickets. And I've asked them to look at their object, figure out where it is that they're going, to the bank, to the metro, to the theater, to the grocery store. And they're going to draw some sort of a picture in the box. And then I'm going to ask them, so does that word finish with an A or an O? Because in Spanish, the ending of a word, of a noun, determines its gender. And that determines what needs to go, how the grammar needs to be structured. So I'm progressively leading them through noticing the different pieces of the grammar so that they can eventually be able to say, I'm going to the bank or I'm going to the theater. Now that's a very, very simplified example, but the idea here is that I'm trying to walk them through each step of what they would have to do in that activity in order to accomplish the task. Here's an example of scaffolding decision-making if maybe the idea was that they were supposed to produce some kind of a game. So they first need to think about what kinds of games they like to play and their favorite games and what makes them fun to play. Then they need to think about how the elements of those games, which elements they might want to include in their own game. So was the game organized around a particular type of genre, you know, a detective or a real estate agent or a doctor? What kind of career pathway was the game organized around? How was the game structured? What do players have to do to win your game? Which elements that you listed are you going to include in your own game so it will be fun to play? What kinds of elements is your game going to use? Is it going to use dice? Is it going to use game pieces? Those are all decisions that we tend to take for granted, but they are things that can really hang up a learner's ability to communicate successfully or to accomplish a task successfully. And we're also going to want to scaffold their thinking for expression. So here's an example, and I've actually got the wrong name at the bottom there. It should be Chad Manis. An example of how someone has scaffolded a think, pair, share. So the student writes the topic in the top, and then the first part of the task is that in the left-hand box, they write what they think about the topic. Then you ask them to pair up with a partner and share their ideas with their partner. And the accountability piece is now they're writing down what their partner thought. Then you're asking them to synthesize with their partner, okay, now that we know what I thought and what you thought, which parts of our combined thinking are we going to share to a larger group? And they put that in the third box. And then as they listen to the class sharing, they write down what they thought was the best pieces, And then they kind of synthesize what they were thinking. So this particular type of a worksheet really helps students to kind of think through each of the pieces, and it supports their noticing and their attention as they engage in the various processes required for both the paired activity and the larger group activities. We can scaffold how students participate in the tasks. So this might be a situation where I put lots of picture prompts on the floor, and we spin an empty water bottle, and whatever picture it lands on, the students have to describe or tell a story about or ask a question about or try to take an alternative perspective about. I might scaffold a task, a communicative task like sentence building with manipulatives like this. So the person or subject is on the left and the verb down the middle, and then the other piece of the sentence on the right, and students are going to move the manipulatives around in order to make sentences. Another example of that in a worksheet format would be that student A gets a blank worksheet, and they're going to connect all of the pieces, and then they're going to read their sentence to a partner. So Joan of Arc bought groceries, in Rouen, or whatever the case might be. And then their partner has to connect those same sentences to see if their papers match. So these are pretty low-level examples, but to give you an idea of what it might look like to scaffold a student's ability to build a sentence by providing them with visual references there. Maybe we're having students do some kind of a survey. So how we lay out the worksheet can make a big difference in a student's ability to accomplish the task. So in this particular situation, I have a sentence frame at the top where I'm asking students what they like. And so you can see that the sentence says what they like, and there's a blank for them to pick from the box below which of the foods they want to talk about out of that word bank. Then you can see that that is the structure we're going to use in order to complete the activity. So when I look at number 1, if I'm partner A, I can see my job is to talk because I have a sentence frame. If I'm partner B, I can see that my job is to listen because I have an ear in my box. For number 2, after I've asked what you like, then my job is to listen to your answer. And if you're partner B, now you're telling me I like or I don't like whatever the food is that you've stuck into the box. And then down at the bottom, I'm keeping a list as partner A. I'm going to write my partner B's name, and then I'm going to write the name of the food if they like it in the heart column, if they don't like it in the X'd out heart column. And so what I'm scaffolding here are all of the decisions the student has to make, the sentence structures that they have to use, how they're going to share the information, and I'm doing it in a way that makes it very clear what they're supposed to do. So you can adapt that for your own projects. I also need to think about how I'm going to scaffold the language required for the task. So in this case, maybe I'm asking students to sequence pictures from a story. And maybe they haven't even read the story yet. Maybe these are wordless stories. So I have, as a beginning teacher, I might have a tendency to say, oh, this particular story at the top is about an elf, and they have these key words in it. And this is a story that they need to talk about the bottom, the vocabulary they need to talk about the bottom story. But what we often don't think about is the vocabulary students will need to accomplish the task. In this case, if I want students to put the pictures in order, what kinds of words or sentences are they going to need to make? So they're going to have to be able at the lowest levels to say yes or no as their partners move things into the right category, or right or wrong, or be able to say at the word level, it goes before, it goes after. As they increase their proficiency level, I would want them to do this task using words like first, the boy washes his face. Next, the squash seed starts to grow out of his ear. Then this other thing will happen. And then eventually I might need to add words like demonstratives or ordinal numbers. So one of the ways that you can think about how to do this is to visualize in your head, okay, here are my learners doing whatever task I've given them to do. What do I anticipate they will say? What is it that I want to hear coming out of their mouths? And which pieces of that am I going to have to pre-teach or introduce? And the idea here is not that we pre-teach all the vocabulary. The idea here is that we set up structures or worksheets that guide their production, like the one that I showed you just a minute ago, in ways that help them to be successful with the task. Here's a really great example of what that might look like. Let's say, for example, that I want students to describe something that has happened, some kind of event sequence in our project. So I've given a place for description, and then I've set up a sentence frame, or rather Chad Manis has set up a sentence frame here for what kind of language they might need, and then they're going to plug in whatever's missing there. If I want them to describe a sequence, then I would use the next sentence frame, and so on and so forth. And so you can start to set up the structures students will need in order to be able to summarize or accomplish whatever the oral task is. And then I can use a host of similar types of worksheets to scaffold different types of tasks. So if I want students to ask questions and then find answers in a text about their career pathway, I can list whatever my question is on the left, leave a space for them to write the answer, and then I can leave a space for them to tell what page number they found that answer on. I can think about what types of analysis I'm having them do, and I can use specific types of sentence prompts to get them to focus on that kind of analysis. What are the parts or the features of whatever it is that I want them to notice? Classify such and such according to whatever features I want them to pay attention to. Make a diagram or a web or a map of. So just with the sentence prompts, you can often provide a lot of scaffolding. I can scaffold by the way I set up the worksheet. So maybe we're brainstorming project ideas, right? One idea here or one possible solution here in large letters. Do you agree or disagree? So once I've written my idea, I'm going to send students around to talk to different people. And you'll notice there's a whole bunch of little boxes here. And the idea here is that after they have provided their idea, they can now go survey everybody in the class or everybody in half the class and find out, do they, to what level do they agree with my idea? And I can tally those by having myself bubble in the sheet each time somebody gives me a response. As I'm talking with my partner, I can have my partner sign over here on the right where it says signature. And in the bottom section of the worksheet, I can ask my partner to give me reasons for why they agree or disagree with my idea. What do they think is good about it, and what concerns do they have? So it not only gives me as the student a place to take notes and to find out how people are viewing my idea, but it also structures the interpersonal interaction and it structures the thinking. So this would be an example of a worksheet that takes care of all of my A, B, C, D, E's in a really powerful way. So as we're asking students to complete these different tasks, we want to think about what is it that they have to do and what are the ways I could have them do it. So if I'm asking them to brainstorm, they could use a concept map. I could provide examples to scaffold. I could provide picture prompts or question prompts to scaffold. I could give them sentence starters, or I could have them use technological tools that would help them help structure the brainstorming process. So for example, a technological tool might be something like, we're going to use Padlet, and each person is going to contribute ideas on Padlet as we brainstorm topics for a public service announcement. I could use similar tools like Wall Wisher for students to brainstorm survival phrases. I could give students a series of inspirational quotes and then have them respond to those in some way. For comparing and contrasting, I need to think about what students are going to need to be able to do. So, for example, asking them to compare the United States and Argentina and what Christmas might be like in those two countries for some sort of project that we're doing. So on the left-hand side, I have question prompts that they're going to respond to about their own traditions. On the right-hand side, I have question prompts for them to interview a native speaker from Argentina. And then in the middle, they're deciding whether the tradition is in common or not. So again, using the structure of the worksheet to scaffold the production. Here are some other examples of compare and contrast typed worksheets. So maybe we're comparing and contrasting the contributions of two key people in preparation for some sort of analysis or evaluation in a project. Or on the right, we have the two different items we're comparing and contrasting, a place for students to write how they're alike, and a place for students to elaborate on their differences. We've already talked about debriefing using Think, Pair, Share. We've also talked in previous models about using technological tools like cider so that students can go through and identify ideas, list pros and cons, vote on their favorite answers. I can have students use structures like human graphing to scaffold their debate. So I can give a continuum of I really am firmly committed to this all the way to I don't really care. And I can ask questions or give prompts and have students stand in front of the appropriate place. And then I can call on students to explain their reasoning or their opinions. And I can provide worksheets to scaffold that explanation. You can have them summarize and scaffold that by asking them to first choose a sentence that they really like out of an article or out of something that somebody said, and then pick a phrase out of that sentence and then reduce that to a single word. You can scaffold discussion by asking them to generate questions and then have them assess themselves based on criteria that the students generate. That one's from Amy Leonard. And then you can have them do pre-writing using graphic organizers, for example. They can predict, so maybe you give them the blurb from the back of a literary text and ask them to tell what happens next. You can scaffold retelling by giving them pictures out of a text and then having them describe those pictures to a partner who then has to put the pictures in the right order. So think about that in terms of what it might look like for processes in your project. And you can scaffold synthesis using Post-it notes, for example, and having people put their favorite ideas and then group them according to what seems to be most important. And again, using sentence stems for those. So in summary, when we're thinking about scaffolding interpersonal communication, we want to give students opportunities to interact, to narrate and describe, to compare and contrast, and to reflect and interpret. And in order to accomplish those tasks successfully, I've given you a bulleted list of some of the key things they have to be able to do. And in the blue, a list of things that might help us to scaffold those communicative activities. We want to make sure that we teach rejoinders, things for them to respond to that. And so you might put lists up in your room if you're an elementary or middle school teacher, or provide a handout if you're a college teacher. And that is the end of our module.